Hello, I'm Dr. Abdulal, and this is the second part of the unit on the human nervous system. And here we'll discuss the divisions of the human nervous system, peripheral and central. And we will discuss the main components of that system. In the previous section, we spoke about the human nervous system in terms of the cellular composition, cellular anatomy, and cellular physiology, how the neurons work. And in the third unit, and the third part of this unit, we are going to speak about the cerebral cortex and the cranial nerves. So let's begin. So the human nervous system is divided into two major divisions in two ways. First, in terms of the anatomy, anatomic division, or when we speak about the anatomy, we speak about the location, about the shape, about the form, about how things just physically, how they are formed and connected, how to describe their location. When we speak about the physiology, we focus on the function. So in terms of anatomy, the human nervous system has two major divisions. One is the central, one is the peripheral division. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. You can simply think about the brain as the physical structure as your kind of hard drive. And the wires, all the cables, all the wires that come out of the hard drive basically are similar to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is simply a bunch of pathways going down and coming up that connect the brain with everything else. So it's simply like when you have a major electrical station and you want to use that station to provide supply a whole town or city. First, you begin with a huge cable that connects with every part of that supply station, and from that cable you take branches that go out to streets and that go out to houses and go out to rooms and so on. So thinking about the brain as the central component, and out of it, all the centers of the brain, they have these wires going together out, and then you take all of these and combine them into a gigantic cable that is called the brain, the spinal cord. The function of the brain is to move the body, to control the body, to move it from outside and inside, to enable you to get sensation from the different parts of the body, outside and inside, to enable you to function in the environment. So the brain and the spinal cord make up the central nervous system, and they are continuous with each other. So the brain is like the tail, as the tail of an animal is connected with the rest of the body. Then the periphery means the outer edges. The peripheral part of the central nervous system, you can think of these parts as the accessories that you connect onto the hard drive, like your mouse, computer, mouse, keyboard, the screen. Excuse me. So all of these become the peripheral components, the outer components. For the brain and the spinal cord, inside of the skull, on this level here, inside of the skull, we have the brain, along the brain stem, we have 12 cranial nerves that come out from each side. So the brainstem has two equal left and right sides, like my right hand, my left hand. That's what the brainstem does. So you have 12 cranial nerves on one side, 12 cranial nerves on the other side. So we call these the 12 cranial nerves, even though there are 24 of them. However, if you study the right side, it is the same as studying the left side. So it's like when you say the anatomy of the hand. You study one hand, and that is the same as the other. So make sure to understand that in all, there are 12 pairs, one pair on the right, one pair on the left of the cranial nerves. And these cranial nerves get out of the brainstem to do other functions outside of it, like controlling the muscles of the face, facial expression muscles like the tongue, for example, muscles of the tongue, muscles of the pharynx, and muscles of the shoulders, and innervation of all the organs inside of the trunk, for example. And then out of the spinal cord itself, that is below the skull, you have the spinal nerves. And the spinal nerves come out left and right, and they innervate different segments of your thorax, of your arms, of your, basically the whole entire body. Because without the brain, you cannot control anything. So again, the nerves, the cranial nerves that come out of the brainstem and the spinal nerves and all the branches coming out of them, they make the peripheral nervous system. So this is the anatomic division of, see, notice two anatomic branches or divisions, the anatomic divisions of the human nervous system. Now, in terms of what the nervous system does, in terms of its physiological divisions, it's based on function, there are two major divisions. One, it has to do with the autonomic functions of the body. Auto means self. So autonomic is self kind of running on its own, basically. So the autonomic nervous system is the system, the parts of the human nervous system that enable the body to run automatically without your conscious control. For example, your sweat glands, when you run, your glands will produce sweat. So you don't have control over that. When, for example, your saliva, when you eat, you produce saliva. Your stomach digests. You are breathing. The blood vessels are controlled in terms of contraction, dilation and contraction to control your blood pressure. A lot of these functions, all of these autonomic nervous system functions are controlled by the autonomic nervous system components, or division. And that autonomic nervous system is divided by itself into two subdivisions. Again, we're speaking about function. So the first division, or the first part of the autonomic nervous system, is the sympathetic nervous system. It is the system that produces energy, enables you to consume energy. And the best example that we have for this is the stress response, or sometimes it is called the fight or flight response. This is when, let's say, it is the same, whether you are camping in a forest and then all of a sudden out of your tent you hear a bear, the sounds of a bear. And you just imagine how you would feel when you hear the sound or when you see the bear. So immediately your sympathetic nervous system is going to release adrenaline or norepinephrine from your epinephrine and from your adrenal cortices, the two cortices on top of the kidneys. And that adrenaline is going to deploy your energy. It will make you burn more energy. It is going to raise your blood pressure. It's going to do a lot of things. For example, you have sweaty palms, you have dry mouth, you have the retention of urine, and a lot of things that occur, physiological changes that occur so rapidly in your body, and you feel flushed and you feel so warm because your body is in high energy mode, high energy drive. Because the body or the nervous system takes it this way, that this could be your last chance, your last fight. So what is the use of storing energy when you might need that energy to run or to fight or whatever it is? The same stress response or fight or flight response, it is the same whether someone asks you a question or someone looks at you the wrong way or treats you, for example, discriminates against you, you immediately start to have that stress response and your blood pressure will go higher. And so now the other system is the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system. That is the system that wants you to kind of lower your energy consumption, because the brain doesn't store energy. and it works its way to conserve energy as much as possible. So the parasympathetic nervous system kind of enables you to rationalize things and say, okay, well, what I'm looking at on the ground is it is a stick. It is not a snake. Or it is just a fake snake. I'm not gonna, be terrified. Oh, so you it makes you think about things in a way as to calm yourself down. Or when, let's say, someone gives you, say, for example, your boss says something nasty to you, and you just immediately start to go on the defensive, and you feel so angry inside and so stressed, and you want to kind of defend yourself, but your sympathetic nervous system tells you, well, you need to pay attention here, you need to be careful, you need to be calm, because if you say the wrong word, you could be fired, or something bad is going to happen, this and that. Maybe you look at yourself, what you have done. Maybe, you shouldn't have done that in the first place. And you kind of keep rationalizing and calming yourself. That system enables you to consume or less energy, to bring your body down back to its usual level. So that is the autonomic nervous system. The other division, functional division of the nervous system is the somatic nervous system. Soma means body. The function of the brain and spinal cord, the function is to both control the body by enabling it to move and stop, by bringing sensation from the different parts that tell you what to do and how to move, or if you should move, and so on. So the somatic nervous system has to do with the voluntary control over your function or your movements. Voluntary movement, control and refinement, gross motor and fine motor. So the initiation and control of voluntary movement are not enough by themselves. So there's one system, the pyramidal system, that enables you to initiate movement and to control movement. But then there is the extrapyramidal system that also goes with that, where you have movement in addition to fine control of movement, so that you can direct the movement to the right target, so that you can you'll achieve precision, like when you play sports or when you dance or when you play, for example, you want to touch something or to fix something. So you need to have both the gross motor functions and the fine motor functions. So again, the autonomic nervous system division, involuntary movements of the body and sensation, the autonomic nervous system has to do with the involuntary control of body functions like digestion, breathing, and so on. And the somatic nervous system has to do with movement and control and refinement of that movement. So it's important not to confuse the anatomic divisions with the physiological divisions. Now let's look at the central nervous system, and we'll look at the components of it. And at the very end of the unit, we'll speak just about the cranial nerves as part of the peripheral nervous system. But now we'll look at the central nervous system, the components of the brain, and the spinal cord. We'll take it from the bottom, from the spinal cord, and then we will build up. We'll go up. So there are 5 major structures of the of the central nervous system. First is the spinal cord. Then the brain stem. The brain stem is these 3 components: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Then we have the cerebellum, which lies behind the brain. So here is the main part of the brain, cerebrum, and the brain stem is beneath it. And there is that pink structure. This one is called the diencephalon. And then you have the cerebellum that lies behind the brainstem and underneath the cerebrum. So then we have the diencephalon, and that is 2 structures. One of them, you can see one side here. There are 2 of these, thalamic nuclei. This is called the thalamus, or a thalamic nucleus. 2 are called the thalamic nuclei. So they are sitting on top of the brain stem. So again, brain stem, diencephalon, and then the cerebellum, and then the cerebrum. See, everything that is sitting on top of these structures, other than, so you have now the brainstem and the diencephalon, and the cerebellum. Everything else that you see, all of this structure here that you see surrounding these, is the cerebrum. Okay, the cerebrum. So these are five major components. The brainstem consists of 3 components. The diencephalon consists of 2 major components, the thalamus, and there's another structure it's not showing here. It's called the hypothalamus. So now, out of these, let's begin to spend a little bit of time on the spinal cord. The spinal cord, we don't spend so much time on it, simply because our main concern is speech and communication, and all of the elements that we need are basically in the cranial nerves. And people like physical therapists or occupational therapists, they will study the spinal cord in detail. But here I'll give you just a quick introduction about the spinal cord. There's a difference between the spinal column and the spinal cord. Think about the spinal column. A column is made out of bricks, made out of blocks, stacked on top of each other. So like these vertebrae. So the vertebrae themselves, the stack of them, all of these make up the column. And each block, or you can, let's say vertebra, each vertebra, as you could see it here, this is the posterior, this is the anterior, this is the posterior, anterior. This is called the spinous process. Like when you see all of these spinous processes stacked on top of each other, and then you can touch the center of your back, and this is what you feel. That is the spine. You touch the tips of the spinous processes of all the spines, the spinal column. So now, right behind, posterior to the end of the spinous process, here there is a canal. In every one of these vertebrae, there's a canal, and that canal is called the spinal canal. Or has other names, but this is the canal where the spinal cord is going to go through. So each one of these has that spinal canal, and the spinal cord then is that basic huge big bundle of nerves that that goes through and goes through all of every vertebra to the very base. So that's how it goes. Now, the spinal cord, because it goes into the spinal column, it has different parts that are based on where it is, based on the location. So in order to know these parts, you need to know the divisions of the spinal column. So the first part is the top segment of the spinal column is the cervical segment. Cervix is the opening around the neck. That is the cervix. And the cervical vertebrae sit on top of the cervix and under the skull. And there are 7 of them. They're basically the vertebrae inside of your neck, in the center of your neck. So they go from C1, cervical vertebra number 1, to C7. There are 7 pieces altogether. So the piece of the spinal cord that passes through the piece of the spinal column, the 7 cervical vertebrae, is called the cervical segment of the spinal column. Now right beneath your clavicle or collarbone, and beneath that bone, and right you go down to like below the last rib, then you have these 12 vertebrae that are called the thoracic, because of the thoracic vertebrae. And earlier in the course, you learned how each one of these vertebra is connected with 2 ribs, right, left, and these go around, and the top 7 of these ribs make the top portion of your thorax, of your rib cage. So that segment goes from thoracic vertebra T1 through T12, and that is that segment of the spinal cord that goes through these vertebrae we call the thoracic segment. And then the lumbar segment, from L1 to L5, and then the sacral segment. And on that level, then the spinal cord divides into 3 major segments. One goes to the right leg, one to the left leg, and one to the lower part of the body. So the main functions, again, of the spinal cord, think about it as um, the pathways that come down to bring motor commands from the cerebral cortex from the top levels of the brain, motor orders, and on the other side you have ascending pathways that bring sensation from different parts of the body. And also the spinal column has the ability to control some reflexes, like the knee jerk, for example, or the withdrawal reflex, like you are sleeping and a mosquito or something, stings you. Then immediately while you are sleeping, your hand is going to be withdrawn from that source of pain. So how you do that is through control, direct control in the spinal cord, that will enable you to control some reflexes or involuntary movements. So here is a cross section of the spinal cord. The spinal cord has a right side and the left side, just like the brain. However, the distribution of the white matter and white matter and gray matter is different. The gray matter here is in the center, and it is shaped like an H or like a butterfly. And there are tracks that, like the descending motor tracks that bring down motor orders, and the ascending motor tracks that bring sensation to sensation about the lower parts of the body. So here you have, out of every vertebra, or every segment near a vertebra, then you have motor and sensory, a spinal cord that comes out, and it has motor functions and sensory functions. And this happens for every single segment. So you can just think about it as simply like wiring. This is the central cable coming, or the central, say, power line. And out of it, you're going to take one branch to innervate, or to supply a building, or to supply, a store or something like that. And as you keep going down, you take branches and branches, more and more, that go to different parts of the body. Okay, so now we are going to start the brain itself, and that is where we've spent basically the rest of the unit focusing on the brain and the different parts of the brain. So we begin with the meningeal layers of the brain. The meninges are protective layers that are on top of the brain. They surround the entire brain. So first you have the scalp. If you go down, you have the scalp, that skin, that where your hair is. Under the scalp, you have the skull, which is the bone. And under the skull, you have the dura mater or the dura mater. The word mater means mother in Latin. So it depends on, both pronunciations are acceptable. If you say my alma, what do you say? My alma mater or alma mater? So when you say alma mater, that is the Latin real pronunciation, mater. However, more people tend to kind of say mater, which is the American pronunciation. So the dura from durable, tough. The dura mater is the outermost layer that lies right beneath the skull. It's a tough layer, and beneath it there is subdural space. There's a space beneath it called the subdural space. And like if there is some kind of blood bleeding or something, we call it the subdural hematoma, for example. And then beneath that space there is the meningeal layer, or known as the I'm sorry. Actually, the dura mater consists of two layers, these blue areas, they are part of the dura mater. Again, that's a tough layer that is right beneath the skull. But then beneath that, there's a subdural space, and beneath the subdural space is the arachnoid mater, or the arachnoid membrane. The arachnoid, when you look at it closely, it has a lot of fibers, and it's almost like a spider's web. And this is why it is called the arachnoid. Arachnoid means spider, or spider-like. So the spider, or the arachnoid membrane, or the arachnoid mater, it has a lot of connections, a lot of fibers connecting down onto the lower level. And it has a lot of blood vessels. And this is where it gains its shape. It is named arachnoid mater or mater. Beneath the arachnoid, there is the subarachnoid space. That's an important area where there is a particular kind of fluid that surrounds the entire brain, and it continues to surround the entire spinal cord. That is called the cerebral spinal fluid. And we'll speak about it. So that is the subarachnoid space. And again, I mentioned about the cerebral spinal fluid being inside of the cerebral of the subarachnoid space, inside of it. And then there's the third layer that is thin, transparent. If you go to the first slide of the previous section or part 1 of this unit, you see the picture of the real brain. What is holding the brain together is that very thin, invisible, transparent layer that is the pia mater. That is like a cellophane-like, but just a layer that surrounds the entire brain, and it comes in touch with the real structure of the brain, with the real neurons and the real neuroglia. So that is the pia mater. The thinnest part. Pia means kind, or loving, because it is very soft and it's very gentle on the structure of the neurons and the glial cells. So these are the three layers again: the dura mater, and then there's the subdural space beneath it. There's the arachnoid mater or arachnoid membrane, and there's the subarachnoid space beneath it. And then there is the pia mater, and that is the layer that comes in contact directly with the tissue of the brain. So now let's look at the functions of the cerebral spinal fluid, or the cerebrospinal fluid. That fluid, as I mentioned, resides in the subarachnoid space here, right above the pia mater, below the arachnoid membrane. And it continues, and the fluid here is connected with certain ventricles, or certain spaces that are filled with fluid that we'll discuss. So the function of that fluid is to maintain constant temperature of the brain and spinal cord. When the body, as it continues to burn, so it can survive, it breaks down glucose molecules and other molecules to produce energy. And that energy is heat. How do you make the body get rid of that heat when it exceeds, when it goes like above the normal temperature of the body? The body has to keep a temperature at 97.5 or 97.6 or 96, something between 97 and 98 degrees. So how do you keep that level steady, especially in the brain and spinal cord? So when there's excess energy, excess heat, the fluid that comes in contact with the different parts here of the brain, that fluid circulates and it carries the heat, and then eventually it is released. It finds its way to be released as sweat. So the sweat expels the extra heat, and fluid continues to circulate from cooler areas to warmer areas, so it can continue to circulate and regulate the heat or the temperature around the brain and spinal cord. So that's a critical function. And when you sweat, that is where the hot, the water in your body that becomes hot, it absorbs the heat from the body and it goes out. And then the cerebrospinal space, because it surrounds the entire brain and the entire spinal cord, it serves as a mechanical cushion, as a protective mechanism to protect the brain during movement. You see people jumping and running and doing all kinds of things, but they don't feel the brain in their head, their skull, like jerking. So that is a gentle kind of way to keep the brain in place, and it allows it to move on the spinal cord without crushing it or without damaging it. And in the meantime, it enables you not to feel the weight of that brain. The weight is 3 pounds, but you do not feel it because it's submerged. It is surrounded by water. It is like you being in water, even though you are, say, maybe 130 or 40 pounds. When someone carries you outside when you are outside of the water, you are very heavy, but inside of the water, your weight becomes much less. So that, in addition to serving as a mechanical cushion, that cerebrospinal fluid enables you not to feel the weight. It makes the weight of the brain and spinal cord lighter. So also the cerebrospinal fluid serves as part of the lymphatic system, as part of the immune system, and where you remember the glial cells that are responsible for the cleanup and maintenance of the brain and the spinal cord. These are called microglial phagocytes, and they, when they accumulate debris and all of this, they bring that to the cerebrospinal fluid, and the body then recycles these dead elements and discards them in the bloodstream through urine or so on. So it enables the body, the brain and spinal cord, to discard the waste from the metabolic processes. So also, in addition, the cerebrospinal fluid serves as a pathway, like as a river, to bring in large nutrients that the brain needs. These nutrients cannot pass through the blood-brain barrier. So now, how many functions are these? 1, 2, and I named another function here that's about not making you feel the weight. That is 3, 4, 5. So 5 main functions of the cerebrospinal fluid. I mentioned that the cerebrospinal fluid is connected with a system that all has fluid inside of the brain nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and that is the ventricles chambers. So first you have, in every hemisphere, you have one ventricle, shaped like this, that has, fluid. And this is the lateral ventricle. On the other side, you have another ventricle. So there are two lateral ventricles. Then there's a lower one beneath these. It's called the third ventricle. And then there is a one across from the cerebellum. That is called the fourth ventricle. There's an aqueduct, or a little tube, that connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and that's called the cerebral aqueduct. So this is the ventricle inside of the brain and spinal cord that is connected with the cerebrospinal fluid and is responsible for all the functions that I mentioned. So you need to know these four ventricles and know that the third ventricle is connected with the fourth through the cerebral aqueduct. So now we are going to speak about the brainstem structures. The brainstem, and we are going up. The spinal cord is continuous, really continuous with the brainstem. There is no point here or anatomic boundary to say, okay, you stop this structure here and you call it this or you call it that. The only thing is that the skull makes the difference. So here is at the bottom, let me see, the base of the skull has a hole called the foramen magnum, at the base of the skull. And the brainstem comes in, it emerges on the other side, beneath the skull. We call the area from beneath the skull to the very end, call it the spinal cord. The area inside of the skull itself, that area, the green and going up, is called the brain stem. Okay? So the foramen magnum, or the big hole, that is where the borderline is between the spinal cord and the brain stem. The brainstem consists of three segments. And again, keep in mind that most of the brainstem is pathways coming down with motor orders that continue to go to the spinal cord, and also ascending tracts that bring sensory information to the top of the brain. So the brainstem has three main components: the medulla oblongata. Oblongata means long, medulla means chamber. The medulla oblongata, the lower part. Then we have the pons. Pons means bridge. And then we have the top segment, which is the midbrain. So these are the three pieces. And the top, the segment on top of that is one side. On the other side, there's another one identical. So that is the thalamus. From the thalamus, there is as you go down, is a structure almost like the neck of an animal, and then there's the head. That structure here is called the hypothalamus. Thalamus also means chamber. So that thalamus and the hypothalamus, they make the diencephalon, but that is separate, different from the brainstem. I just want you to remember that the diencephalon sits on the brainstem. So let's look at the brainstem functions. Generally, the brainstem is the oldest part of the human nervous system, or any nervous system, as a matter of fact. It is the part that exists before anything else, and because imagine when there's the fertilization and the egg and the nervous system begins to form, like 3 weeks, you want a nervous system that will go and control when the heart comes to existence, when the stomach, everything, it's going to control heartbeat It's going to control all kinds of functions. So the brainstem is the most primitive structure of the nervous system. Primitive means it has to do with survival, mostly survival things that keep your body alive. So it contains, in addition to these areas, contain many clusters of pathways specialized in different autonomic functions, mostly autonomic and reflexes. And also, it gives origin to 12 cranial nerves. So here's the base of the skull. There would be here. And along the brainstem, there are 12 cranial nerves that you'll study later. These are parts of the peripheral nervous system. So we are going to look at the general functions of the brainstem as a whole, and then we take each segment of it and we discuss some highlights, some basic functions of it. So here is a lateral view of the brainstem and the diencephalon. Here is an anterior view. Just to give you an idea, the pons here, as you can see, some parts are connected. The pons is connected with the cerebellum. And this, you don't see the cerebellum here, you just see the pons. We'll discuss it later. But this is an anterior view, and this is a lateral view. So overall, the brainstem, as I mentioned, is concerned with autonomic nervous system functions. It receives sensory information from the skin and muscles of the head, for example, because of the cranial nerves. It provides motor control over facial muscles and inside and outside, oral muscles, pharyngeal muscles, neck and shoulder movement, for example. It also serves as a relay for sensory information from the spinal cord, that has to do with information about, for example, how you move your trunk, your legs, your different lower body, your toes. And it also regulates levels of arousal and awareness through a structure that is called the reticular formation. That reticular formation is the oldest part of the brainstem. So, and it is like a worm-like structure that goes from the very top of the brainstem way down to the medulla. That is, you could see it here, brown, and it has dark brown patches and light brown patches randomly organized. This is where we call it reticulated. It looks like the colors of a giraffe. So generally, the brainstem, it has also nuclei, clusters, centers of gray matter, and like cell bodies, in other words, that are deep there, and they control various functions. Remember that the gray matter, or bodies of neurons, most of them exist in the cerebral cortex, the very top layer of the brain. But when you find them, bodies of neurons below the cerebral cortex, we call these nuclei or bodies, or so these centers that include lots of cell bodies of neurons are in the brainstem. They regulate various functions. For example, the superior olivary nucleus has to do with hearing, helps in hearing. The cardiovascular center that regulates the heart functions. And there are respiratory centers that regulate breathing. So some of these nuclei process information about three senses: hearing, as the Oliver nucleus, balance also here, and taste. So because there are cranial nerves that come out of these to control these functions. The medulla oblongata, now we'll take the structures one by one and we discuss the various functions of each one. The medulla oblongata has centers, for example, that control digestion, breathing, and heart rate. And as you can see in the different views here. The brains, the pons, here's the pons. Look at the cerebellum. It is connected with the pons. And there are three peduncles, three arms, that basically three cables that bring out all the connections from the cerebellum and bring them out so you can connect with the brainstem and the rest of the brain and the spinal cord. So these three arms are called, here's one, the superior cerebellar peduncle, going up through the midbrain and to the cerebral cortex. Then there's the inferior cerebellar peduncle that is going to go down through the brainstem. Through the brainstem and the spinal cord. And then there is the middle cerebellar peduncle that is going to continue to form this whole area of the pons. See that area here. So the fibers from the middle cerebellar peduncle, they go out and around the brainstem and hug it like this, and they form the bridge. Pons means bridge. So the functions of the pons is to relay motor input or output. Motor input from the cerebral hemispheres to the cerebellum. So they bring down motor commands down to the cerebellum. Please do not confuse cerebrum with cerebellum. So that is one of the major functions. Then in terms of the midbrain, these are the pathways here that go up. There's another set on the other side. Its function is to coordinate many sensory and motor functions, including, for example, eye movement. You move your eyes up and down laterally and so on. That movement of the eyes is controlled by cranial nerves that arise from the midbrain. So cranial nerves number 2, 3, and 4. And also coordination of visual and auditory reflexes. For example, we learned earlier that the superior colliculus here is the structure that enables you to combine your hearing with your motor functions for face and eyes. That enables you, when you hear a voice or a sound somewhere, you turn your head and your body towards that and fixate your eyes on the sound source. So that midbrain basically has pathways that are coming down to bring motor commands, and also pathways that are coming out to bring sensation from different parts of the body. And in addition, it enables you to coordinate eye movement and to enable you it gives you the visual auditory reflex. Now we have finished the brain stem. We are going to look at the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is like a little brain by itself. And it has centers basically for everything. And every center of it that, say, for example, language centers in it are connected with the language centers of the hemispheres. So, for example, the right hemisphere of the cerebellum is connected with the left hemisphere of the cerebrum, and the opposite is the same. It's true. The cerebellum, as I mentioned, it has a right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and all the information from the cerebellum, all the connections, all the neurons come together to connect with each other in the middle of the cerebellum in an area called the cerebellar vermis. Vermis. V-E-R-M-I-S. Vermis means worm. So it looks like a worm. It is similar to the corpus callosum. It is the area that connects the right hemisphere of the cerebellum with the left. Then all the information, all the connections from the cerebellum, they come out in the form of three big cables that I have just explained. And these cables, one of them goes up to through the brain, the midbrain, to the higher levels, and one goes into the medulla and down into the spinal cord, and one goes to form the pons. So this is how all the input that goes into the cerebellum comes in from these and goes out also from these peduncles or arms. The functions in terms of physiology of the cerebellum, it contributes to our fine motor control. So, for example, you have a motor command coming from the cerebral cortex. Move your toe, your big toe, for example. So that command comes down, and then a copy of it goes to the cerebellum, and then goes down to the toe, is transferred to the motor pathways that go down to your toe. Then you move, for example, in a certain way. You are told to move your toe. You want to move your toe in a certain way, maybe like this or maybe like that. The cerebellum is going to have a copy of the motor order, and it's going to have a copy of what the muscles are doing down there, what the toe is actually doing down there. So it gets information from the joints of the toe and from the muscles that move the toe, and from the movement, about the movement, how the movement is happening. And it compares these two to identify errors, like you want this, but this is not happening. You want that, but it is not, it's happening the wrong way. So it identifies inconsistencies between the motor command and what the muscles and joints are really doing in the field down there. And then it sends the feedback to the cerebral cortex, where motor planning and motor commands are made, and then you are able to correct the movement as the movement continues to be produced. So it contributes significantly to editing of motor commands to give you fine motor control. It modifies the force and the range of movement. Like you want to shake hands with someone. Of course, we can't do this nowadays. But in the old days, I mean. So someone is going to just, if you press too hard, that is not acceptable. If you don't press enough, that is not acceptable. It shows lack of interest. So how do you just press just to the level that's the Goldilocks level, just right? That is, the cerebellum enables you to modify the force and the range of your movement. It contributes to motor learning, like sports, dancing, running, and so on. Anything that requires sequential movements, as you do that, the cerebellum is going to enable you to learn how to master that precision. It contributes to cognitive functions and to language functions. And people who have damage in the cerebellum, in certain cases, they could have difficulty with pragmatics, with social communication. They might have difficulty regulating the tone of their voice, for example. So it contributes significantly. However, the role of the cerebellum in that is not yet completely understood. It's not completely, not many people know this role, even though we do know a lot about it, but many people do not know that kind of the cognitive and language functions, unfortunately. But there's a lot of information about it today. The diencephalon, as I explained, it is, let's go back here, it is the structure that sits on top of the brain stem, and it has the thalamus on one side, another thalamus. You call these together the thalamic nuclei. And from the thalamus, or from the thalamic nuclei, you have that structure coming down that is known as the hypothalamus. It goes from here to here, and it has a little extension that is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland itself doesn't do much. It's only a pouch to a gland to save hormones that are produced by the thalamus. So let's discuss that here while we are speaking, we have the image. The thalamus has about 10 compartments. It's divided into 10 major segments, major sections. And it serves as the gateway for many sensory mechanisms. So, for example, let's come here. Here is a structure that we studied. It's called the medial genicular body. We know this is called, another name for it in function, it is called the auditory thalamus. The auditory thalamus. It is dedicated to hearing. Remember, from the inferior colliculus, there's a pathway that goes to the auditory thalamus, or goes to the medial genicular body. And there, the auditory signals become fine-tuned, become refined. And if they are not loud enough, they can be amplified up to 50 times. So the thalamus generally is a center for fine-tuning, for decreasing movement, for increasing, decreasing the force, for example, of movements, for regulating, different levels like hearing, sounds, sensation that is coming in, enabling you to kind of basically have control over your output as well. Some children have difficulty with this. Sometimes there's so much noise coming in, they close their ears. They just can't take it because their thalamus cannot do it for them. It can't fine tune. It can't soften the noises, for example, for them like it should. So it gates sensory stimuli. And then the hypothalamus, as you could see it, inside of it, it has various structures, several, and each one has different functions. But the hypothalamus is part of the autonomic nervous system. It basically serves autonomic nervous system functions. For example, controlling emotions, for giving you drives, like sexual drive, For example, endocrine functions like milk, like baby, when the mother is born, she produces milk because of the hypothalamus. When the baby the mother feels the baby crying, hears the baby crying, immediately the hypothalamus releases milk immediately. So that is autonomic. It also controls endocrine functions. As I mentioned, control of milk, sexual drive, thirst. The hypothalamus has connections with the inside of the blood vessels, and it can measure the osmolarity, the acidity level of and alkalinity level of the blood. The blood has to keep a particular level of osmolarity, and if it is too much water, then it is discarded through urine. If it is less water inside of the bloodstream, then the thalamus causes you to be thirsty. So you can go and have water to replenish yourself, and your blood will not be as acidic. Many visceral functions as well that are controlled, but the thalamus is also connected with your emotional system, so that when you see a threat or hear a threat, the thalamus is what deploys, what communicates with the kidneys to deploy. The adrenal cortices, the cortices on top of the kidneys to deploy adrenaline, so you can raise your blood pressure and go through the whole cycle of the fight or flight response. So now, in the remaining section, we are going to speak about the cerebrum. We're going to speak about the different parts of it, and we will leave the most extensive part of it for the third section. If you recall, so far we spoke about the spinal cord, the brainstem, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum. All of these structures, everything else above that, all of this structure that you could see, the biggest part is the cerebrum. And the cerebrum has these structures. First, it consists of two hemispheres, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. And between the two hemispheres, there is a structure that connects them here. This is the white matter, by the way, all the fibers, axons of neurons, and how they make the white matter. So the white matter from the right hemisphere is connected with the left with the white matter in the left hemisphere through a highly condensed pathway or commissure, like a bridge, that is called the corpus callosum. Callus means tough. So that is the corpus callosum that connects right hemisphere, left hemisphere. You can see the fibers, here, and this the largest pathway that connects the two different parts of the brain together. Here you can see it will be in this area. Yeah, if you cut the brain like this coronally. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. So they come, all them like neurons and pathways that are coming from one side, they cross at the brainstem to the opposite side of the body. So the parts of the cerebrum, you need to really pay attention, because names can be confusing. First, understand the cerebellum is different than the cerebrum. And the cerebrum has all these parts. First, the top layer of it, 4 millimeters, this thin or this thick here, that is called the cortex of the cerebrum. Make it easy on you, cerebral cortex. Cerebral or cerebrum, cortex means tree bark. So it serves as the outer layer that surrounds the brain. Like a tree bark surrounds a tree trunk. So beneath the cerebral cortex, this tiny margin here, there is the white matter. And I explained that the cerebral cortex is called the gray matter because it looks gray because of all the oxygen and glucose inside of the bodies of neurons, and bodies of neurons reside inside of the cortex, and a lot of the glial cells also reside there. And then beneath that you have the white matter. And then you have clusters of cell bodies, and these are called ganglia, or are called bodies or nuclei, all these names. So like this is one of them. The basal ganglia are a whole, like several structures together that are deep in the white matter, and they're called the basal ganglia. And then there's the hippocampus, and there's the amygdala. So how many structures does the cerebral cortex have? The cerebrum have? If I ask you to name all of them. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then at some point we'll go and explain the levels of the cortex. But just know that the cortex is part of the cerebrum. So the basal ganglia, first, include 5 structures, major structures. One of them is called the putamen. One is called the globus pallidus. And then we have the caudate nucleus. We have the subthalamic nuclei beneath the thalamus. And then we have the substantia nigra. You look here, these are the biggest parts of the basal ganglia. The putamen, the caudate or the tail of the putamen, and then here is the tail of the caudate, for example. So and then there's another structure here that's not clearly visible. But if you cut this coronally like this is what you see. So you have the putamen, look at it here, putamen, cut like that. Next to it, you have the globus pallidus, these 2 structures here. And then you have the caudate nucleus, which is this structure that is cut but higher. And then you have subthalamic nuclei and substantia nigra. So these are the basal ganglia, deep inside of the white matter. Okay. All right, so before we get there, we just wanted to highlight another function of the corpus callosum, which is basically integration of sensory information with motor information, with emotional information, with cognitive functions, and with language functions. All of these have to be coordinated. For example, let's take just one example. Now this is the left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere. And in the left hemisphere, there are language fundamentals like grammar, vocabulary, and so on. So that left hemisphere interprets sentences, just the meaning, the concrete meaning. Like you say, there are, or it was raining cats and dogs, or he kicked the bucket. So let's say he kicked the bucket. immediately the left hemisphere says, oh, a person just literally kicked a bucket. But it's in the context of the conversation. When you say he kicked the bucket and say, oh, there's a funeral. You say, what does the kicking a bucket has to do with the funeral? Then the right hemisphere takes over and says, no, kicking the bucket doesn't mean what, the exact concrete meaning. It means dead. Someone is dead. So it gives you the metaphorical. It gives you the abstract meaning. So in here, you connect the concrete, you connect different, different levels of meaning. So integration of various functions, blending them together so that you can do something. For example, you are listening, you are playing karate, and then you are making some moves with the whole team. You are watching your visual cortex gives you information from what you see, and then you need to coordinate this with your motor functions. You need to control that with your cognitive skills so that you know exactly when to act, how to act, and so on. So all of these functions have to be integrated so you can be a normal human being. And the basal ganglia, as I mentioned, there are 5 major structures that lie deep beneath the white matter, and they include these 5 structures: putamen, globus pallidus, caudate, nucleus, substantia nigra, and subnuclei. And they have major functions. For example, the major functions include, and they have extensive connections with the frontal lobe of the brain, the motor areas, and the cognitive areas here in the prefrontal cortex. These 3 major pathways that regulate motor regulation, movement, and another pathway that regulates mood and emotional states, enables you to control your emotions and to feel your emotions. And another enables you to regulate language and social communication skills. So the basal ganglia are really critical in connecting the cerebral functions, the upper parts of the brain, with the lower parts of the lower levels of the brain and the spinal cord. The hippocampus here, the hippocampus is responsible for processing of memories, processing of information, and sorting it out in terms of memory storage. The hippocampus is located beneath, in the temporal cortex, temporal lobe, behind the medial temporal gyrus. And it does not store memory for good. It stores it for about an hour or so. But it processes incoming memories, all the sensory channels like vision, hearing, and so on. All the information that gets into your brain is going to find its way to this structure here, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is going to determine how important the information is, where it should be stored, if the information should be stored or not. If the information has high level of importance, it will tag it, and it gives it a high level of priority to be stored so it can be accessed quickly and when you need it. So the hippocampus has extensive pathways that connect it with the prefrontal cortex. This is the central command of your body. So constantly it is going. Also, it has pathways that connect to all different parts where the information is stored. So any information that comes in is sorted out, is processed, and it is then it is sent to storage sites in different parts of your brain. When you want to retrieve that information, to get it, to use it, like you are going to write something, or you are going to write an email, or say something to someone, or have a conversation, you have to go to the hippocampus, and it will get you the information from the storage sites. So the hippocampus is important for encoding, for sorting out incoming information, directing and sending it to the storage sites so it can be transferred to long-term memory. And it enables you to retrieve information from your storage sites while you are spelling something or reading or writing or taking an exam, and on and on. So that is the hippocampus. Hippocampus is an ancient Syrian word, ancient Phoenician word meaning seahorse. Okay, and then the amygdala is the last part here of the cerebrum, the amygdala. It's a little structure, is sometimes called the amygdala nucleus as well, a little structure that is connected with the basal ganglia and the hippocampus, also in the left and the temporal cortex, of course, left and right, and the temporal cortex. That is your emotional processing center. It processes your fears. It processes your social experiences. And if someone, for example, has phobias, the amygdala is very hyperactive, and it makes the person just, kind of react irrationally to a spider or to, something. It also it has it responds to endocrine commands. For example, like when you see a threat, immediately the information goes to the hippocampus, to the amygdala, and then you start to immediately evaluate something in terms of how dangerous it is and how friendly it is. Social communication is also, or emotions that have to do with socialization are also processed in the amygdala. The amygdala has a special connection with the hippocampus. So anything that has an emotional value is quickly remembered. It is tagged with high importance. Whenever the amygdala is activated, then the hippocampus is activated. So when they are in an emotional state, high, very, very happy, or very, very upset, automatically the hippocampus is active, and it processes and stores everything. It processes for long-term storage, that information. And you remember where you were, what you were wearing, what happened exactly, how you reacted, and you remember crazy details. So that is the connection between the amygdala and the hippocampus. Lastly, I wanted to mention something about lateralization, left and right, and especially in the context of language. We understand that we have the two hemispheres for a reason, and we need both of them. We cannot function just with one. So literally, when you say someone is right hemisphere, left hemisphere, nowadays it doesn't make sense. It isn't as simple. There is no person who is like a right hemisphere person, left hemisphere person. That is just, it was a commercial, thing that they did to sell books and testing and stuff like that. But you need both hemispheres in order to perform normal functions. The left and also the brain doesn't have, the left hemisphere doesn't have exactly the same functions of the right hemisphere, because the brain wants to diversify its functions. There is no value if you have a Broca's area or language centers here and language centers there. What is the purpose? You want to have different stations, different parts do different functions, so that you give information from one part to the other, and you do more work this way. So like you can do more with less. So in the left hemisphere, you can do phonological processing. You can process sounds, individual sounds, combine them with together to make syllables, to make words. So the syntax. You construct words out of other words, like say polite, and then politeness. You make a word out of the other. All of this in the left hemisphere. Word semantics, the meaning of individual words, and so on. The grammar. Is this word a noun, a verb? How do you make a sentence? All of this in the left hemisphere. Grammatical rules are in Broca's area. Analytical skills. So you process the commands of speech, or when someone says a sentence, for example. However, the interpretation of language in the left hemisphere tends to be literal, especially when you go on the single sentence level. So yes, it analyzes, it focuses on tiny details, but it gives you a literal interpretation, concrete. But when you go beyond the concrete, when you speak about metaphors, when you speak about things that you can't see in words, like idioms, kick the bucket, or this person is for example, is a roaring lion, whatever. So the right hemisphere comes in. It looks at the whole context. It looks at the whole, what happened with your body language while you were saying, get out of here. Were you angry? How was your emotions, and so on? And then it interprets what's being said. Oh, that is friendly. That is just a joke, and so on. It understands jokes, metaphors, anything that is abstract. Then you need the right hemisphere to help you make sense of it. And the right hemisphere, of course, doesn't have the raw material. It has to go to the left hemisphere to take the information from there and work on it. So it is concerned with emotional processing, facial expressions, being able to understand the tone of voice, someone else's voice, enabling you to speak and convey the right tone of voice with what that matches the meaning of what you want to say. It enables you to understand the intention of a speaker. Again, it is dominant for theory of mind. I'm going to explain it in a minute, but also it enables you to make inferences. For example, you see someone, you see, for example, someone listening to the news and immediately getting out. You say, you need to go out quickly to the store. Or you say, the news, there must have been a hurricane or something, an announcement, maybe there's bad weather and the person is going to go to the store to buy this or that. The baby sees the mother going to the closet to get a coat. The baby sees the mother and the coat and immediately starts crying. Why? Because the right hemisphere told them that, made an inference that, the coat is linked with going out. Then I'm not going to have mom. So, and then the general aspects of discourse production, like producing connected speech, making a story, comprehending a story, making sense of what someone says. Both of these are all regulated hemisphere. So I just wanted to give you just a brief summary of these differences. And this concludes our second part of unit of the unit on the nervous system. And the third part is going to be dedicated to the cranial nerves and the cerebral cortex. Thank you.